The night was darker than most, the kind of night that swallowed sound and made footsteps echo louder than they should. Clara's heart raced as she clutched the torn hem of her dress, her breath ragged in the cool desert air. The train she had jumped off hours ago had long since disappeared into the horizon, but the fear of being followed hadn't left her. Every crunch of gravel beneath her boots made her flinch. Every shadow felt like a hand reaching for her. She wasn't just running from a place. She was running from a past that had nearly killed her. And though her body ached, her spirit screamed one thing: don't stop. Her thoughts scattered between panic and exhaustion. Memories of harsh hands, cruel words, and the suffocating walls of her former life burned in her mind. Clara had been raised to believe men only wanted control, that safety was a lie, and love was a weapon used against the weak. She had promised herself that if she ever escaped, she would never again let anyone close enough to hurt her. That promise was the only thing keeping her moving as she stumbled along the dirt road that stretched endlessly into the plains. The faint glow of lantern light caught her eye in the distance. A ranch! She froze, torn between the instinct to avoid strangers and the desperate need for shelter. Her lips trembled with indecision. She had no money, no plan, and nowhere else to go. The open fields around her offered no cover, no safety from the night, or from men she feared might still be searching for her. She had heard whispers in town before she fled. There was a rancher living far out, a man named Ethan, who kept to himself. People said he was strange, brooding, maybe even dangerous. But as Clara hugged herself against the cold, she thought, danger she could handle. Kindness? That was harder to trust. Ethan's ranch loomed like a shadowed island in the sea of land. The house was simple, rugged with darkened by time, a lone lantern flickering on the porch. Clara hesitated at the gate, her fingers trembling as she gripped the worn wood. She wanted to turn away. She wanted to disappear back into the night. But her legs betrayed her, carrying her forward, because survival was louder than fear. She knocked, softly at first, then again, her heart hammering as the door creaked open. The man who appeared was everything she expected, and nothing like she feared. Ethan was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face marked by years of sun and loss. His eyes were dark, not cruel, but heavy, as if they had carried too much sorrow for too long. He didn't speak right away, just studied her with a quiet stillness that made Clara's skin prickle. She braced herself for questions, for demands, for the kind of voice that would make her shrink inside herself. Instead, he simply stepped aside and said, "You look cold. Come in." Inside, the warmth of the fire should have been comforting, but Clara's guard refused to lower. She stood near the door, her arms wrapped around her thin frame, ready to flee at the slightest shift in his tone. Ethan didn't press her. He poured water into a tin cup and set it on the table, then moved back to the fire, his movement steady and unhurried. The silence stretched, but it wasn't suffocating. It was strange, gentle. Clara sipped the water with trembling hands, her eyes never leaving him. Finally, her voice broke the quiet, raw and sharp from disuse. "I don't want trouble. I just need a place for the night." Her words cracked, but she forced them out as if they were a shield against rejection. Ethan looked at her, not with suspicion, but with a steady kind of respect that unsettled her even more. "There's a spare room," he said simply. "You'll be safe there." The word safe hit her harder than she expected. Safe. It was a word she didn't believe in anymore. She almost laughed, but it came out more like a sob, quickly stifled behind her hand. She nodded, keeping her gaze low, afraid of what he might see if their eyes met. Ethan showed her the small room at the end of the hall. The bed was plain, the blanket warm but clean. Clara stood at the doorway, her chest rising and falling as if she'd just run another mile. I'll stay here," she whispered, almost ashamed of needing it. He gave a single nod, then placed a lantern on the dresser. "I'll be down the hall," he said. "The door locks from the inside. Use it if you want." When he left, she pressed her forehead against the door, her whole body trembling. She turned the lock with shaking fingers, and only then did the tears come, silent, endless tears that soaked the blanket as she curled up on the bed. She didn't know this man. She didn't know if she could trust him. But for the first time in years, She hadn't been yelled at, grabbed, or belittled. For the first time in years, she had been given a choice. That night, Clara didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house made her jolt. Every whisper wind felt like footsteps. But through it all, she remembered his words, "You'll be safe there." She didn't believe it yet. Not fully, but she wanted to. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step. The morning sun spilled across the horizon, painting the sky with soft gold and crimson. Clara stirred awake in the small guest room, her body stiff from restless sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was, until the faint smell of coffee drifted through the cracks in the door. Panic flashed across her chest, quick and sharp, as memories of yesterday came rushing back. She sat up, clutching the blanket as if it were armor. Then she remembered his words. The door locks from inside. Use it if you want. And she had. The lock was still firmly in place. No one had tried to come in. She moved to the window and peeked outside. There he was, the man from last night. Ethan. He was already at work, his broad frame moving steadily as he fed the horses, checked the water troughs, and fixed a loose hinge on the barn door. His movements weren't hurried or harsh. They were calm, methodical, as though he lived his whole life by a rhythm only he understood. Clara studied him carefully, bracing for the arrogance she was sure would show. But it never came. He didn't look around for an audience, didn't bark orders, didn't slam tools like a man needing control. He simply worked. When she finally gathered enough courage to step out of the room, the floor creaked under her hesitant steps. Ethan was at the table, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up, and their eyes met briefly. Clara tensed, ready for a demand, for that lingering look men often gave when they thought they owned the space around them. But Ethan just gave a small nod and gestured the pot. "There's plenty left," he said. His voice was steady, deep, without a trace of expectation. Clara's brows furrowed. She moved slowly, like an animal expecting a trap. She poured herself a cup, her fingers trembling, then sat at the far end of the table. The silence stretched between them, awkward for her, but strangely natural for him. After a moment, Ethan set his cup down and leaned back in his chair. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said. "Respect comes first. Always. The rest doesn't matter." The word startled her more than she cared to admit. Respect comes first. No man she had ever known had said something like that, much less lived by it. She studied him carefully, searching for the lie beneath his calm exterior. But there was none. He wasn't looking at her with hunger or pity or even curiosity. He was simply stating a fact, like a man pointing out the weather. Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands, callous from years of work. "I don't know what you've been through," he continued quietly, "and I won't ask unless you want to tell me. You're under my roof, and that means you're safe here. That's all." Then he stood, collected his hat from the hook, and headed toward the door. Clara blinked, stunned. That was it? No questions? No accusations? No demands in exchange for shelter? He left her sitting there with her untouched coffee, her chest tight with confusion. All her life, safety had been a bargain, a price, a chain disguised as kindness. She had been trained to expect it. If a man gave you something, he would take double in return. Yet here was Ethan, who gave her space, food, and even the locked door without asking for anything. She didn't trust it, couldn't. But the longer she sat there, the more she realized she hadn't imagined it. He really had walked away. Outside, Ethan worked through the morning like clockwork. But inside, his mind wasn't as steady as his hands. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the kind that no storm or wild animal could carve into a person. That fear was man-made, and it stirred something deep in him. He knew better than to pry. He knew better than to crowd her. The cowboy's code he lived by was simple, taught by his father long ago. You never take what ain't freely given. You never break what's already fragile. And you always stand between danger and the ones who can't fight it themselves. So he gave her distance. He didn't linger in the house longer than necessary. He didn't step closer than the space she seemed comfortable with. At meal times, he'd make sure food was there, then busy himself with chores outside, leaving her free to eat without the weight of his gaze. He didn't realize how shocking this was for Clara but to him, it was the only way to live. For Clara, each passing hour felt like standing in a foreign land. The silence of the ranch was strange, but it wasn't threatening. The man who owned it was stranger still. That afternoon, she caught sight of him returning from the pasture, dust clinging to his boots, sweat streaking his shirt. He looked every bit the rugged cowboy people had warned her about. And yet, when he noticed her watching from the porch, he tipped his hat politely, then walked past without a word. The small gesture rattled her. She had braced for a smirk, for a line, for something meant to claim her. Instead, all she got was respect. Real, unspoken, unsettling respect. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was almost worse than cruelty, because it left her unprepared. How could she fight against kindness? How could she guard herself against someone who didn't want anything at all? That night, as she returned to the little room, Clara whispered to herself, "Why doesn't he—" The question trailed off unanswered. Why didn't he demand? Why didn't he press? Why didn't he see her the way all men did? It was the first time in years that confusion, not fear, kept her awake. And down the hall, Ethan lay awake too, stretched out on his bed but staring at the ceiling. He could feel the weight of her presence in the house, fragile as a bird with broken wings. His instincts told him to protect her, but his code reminded him. Protection wasn't ownership. Safety wasn't about keeping someone. It was about letting them choose to stay, and he knew better than most the power of choice. The night fell heavy over the ranch, the kind of silence only wide plains knew, broken only by the low whistle of wind to the cracks of old wood. Clara stood stiff in the doorway of the bedroom. Her bag clutched to her chest as Ethan gestured casually to the bed. "You'll sleep here," he said simply. Her stomach knotted. She knew the script all too well. Men offering comfort, only to strip away when the door closed. Her throat went dry, her body ready to bolt. "And you," she whispered, suspicion trembling beneath the words. Ethan didn't hesitate. He bent down, pulled an extra quilt from the trunk, and dropped it on the wooden floorboards beside the bed. "I'll be here," he said. "That's close enough if you need something. Far enough if you don't." Clara's eyes widened. She almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about it. The man of the house, sleeping on the floor? It went against every scarred memory in her past. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. Ethan's gaze met hers, steady, unflinching. "Because respect comes before comfort, before anything." His voice was low, gravelly from years of dust and silence, but it carried a conviction so firm that it stole her breath. For a moment, she just stared, waiting for the smirk, for the trap, for the switch in tone that always came. But none followed. He simply lowered himself onto the floor, stretching his long frame with practiced ease, as though he'd done this 100 times before. He tipped his hat forward to cover his eyes. "Get some sleep," he murmured. Clara stood frozen. Her mind screamed it couldn't be real. Men didn't work this way. Men didn't give without taking. Men didn't surrender their comfort, their pride, their power. Yet here was Ethan, the cowboy whose rough hands could break stone, lie on the floor as if her trust was worth more than his bed. She climbed onto the mattress cautiously, the sheets smelling faintly of soap and cedar. But she didn't lie down. Not fully. Instead, she sat against the headboard, knees pulled tight to her chest, watching him from the corner of her eye. Every rise and fall of his chest, every shift of his shoulders made her heart leap in panic. Was he pretending? Was he waiting for her to close her eyes? Hours bled into one another. The lantern on the dresser flickered low, casting shadows across his broad frame. Yet he never moved toward her. Not once. The floor creaked only when he shifted for comfort, turning from one side to the other, as any man would after a long day of labor. Clara's thoughts raced. Why would he do this? What does he gain? She searched for answers in the lines of his face, softened now by sleep, and found none. Only exhaustion, only the kind of stillness that belonged to a man carrying his own burdens. The night stretched endlessly. She lay down eventually, still tense, her eyes fixed on him like a sentinel guarding against betrayal. Every time her lids grew heavy, she forced them open again. Trust was a luxury she hadn't known in years, and she wasn't about to hand it over to a stranger. not even one who gave up his bed for her. Yet, sometime before dawn, Clara realized something strange. Her body, taut with suspicion at first, had loosened. Her breath matched the rhythm of his. The space between them felt less like a battlefield and more like a fragile truce. She hadn't fallen asleep. Not yet, but for the first time in years, she wasn't entirely terrified to close her eyes. And Ethan? He didn't stir to check if she was watching. He didn't push her for gratitude. He didn't even notice the tears she quietly wiped away into the pillow. Confused at kindness she had no idea how to accept. By the time the rooster crowed and the first light slipped through the curtains, Clara was still awake. Her body ached with fatigue. But her heart carried something heavier, a question she couldn't let go of. What kind of man chooses a floor when the bed is right there? It was only then that she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Ethan's code wasn't an act. Maybe he truly meant what he said. And a terrifying, beautiful possibility pressed against her ribs. What if she was finally safe? Morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, catching in Clara's loose hair as she carefully measured grain into a tin bucket. The ranch was alive with quiet sounds. Hens scratching, horses shifting in their stalls, the steady creak of wood against the wind. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara wasn't just standing in the corner watching Ethan work. She was trying. It started small. She offered to carry water to the trough, though her arms trembled with the weight of the pail. She swept the porch while Ethan hauled hay. She even gathered eggs from the hens, though her heart raced at every peck. None of it was much compared to the endless list of chores a ranch demanded, but Ethan never dismissed her effort. Every time, without fail, he tipped his hat or nodded his thanks. "Appreciate that," he'd say when she set down the water. "Thank you kindly," when she placed the eggs on the counter. Not a command, not an expectation, just gratitude, spoken as though her smallest act carried the weight of the world. Clara found herself caught off guard. Men in her past had never thanked her, never noticed her work unless it wasn't good enough. Here, Ethan noticed everything. The careful way she set plates, the way she folded towels. Even when she straightened the old quilt on the bed, he refused to use. Each word of thanks chipped away at a wall she hadn't realized was still so high. One afternoon, she lingered by the corral, watching Ethan mend a fence. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, but steady. He worked with the same quiet patience he showed her, knotting rope with care instead of haste. Clara felt something stir in her chest. A question, a fear, maybe even a hope. Maybe not every man is like the ones I knew. The thought frightened her more than it comforted, because hope meant risk. Trust meant pain if she was wrong. And yet, as Ethan straightened and caught her watching, tipping his hat with a small smile of acknowledgement, Clara didn't flinch away. That evening, as she stirred the pot of stew, Ethan came in from the fields. Dust clung to his shirt, his boots heavy with dirt. He washed up at the basin, then sat at the table where she placed a bowl before him. "Smells real good," he said, his voice warm. Her hand froze around the ladle. He didn't just thank her, he meant it. She saw in his eyes. And in that quiet kitchen, with the fire crackling and the wind pressing against the walls, Clara felt something unfamiliar settle over her chest. Not love, not yet, but the faintest, trembling possibility that maybe, just maybe, safety wasn't a dream after all. The storm outside rattled the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm that lived inside Clara. She lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the ranch house pulling her back into memories she tried so hard to bury. She could still hear the slam of doors, the cruel laughter, the way a heavy hand had always found her shoulder before dragging her somewhere she didn't want to go. In the darkness, those memories sharpened. She remembered the first time she'd been told she was worthless, how the words had sunk into her bones until she believed them. She remembered the night she'd begged for kindness and found only fists. The scars on her body had faded, but the ones in her heart had not. No matter how far she ran, the ghosts of her past clung to her, whispering that no man could ever be trusted. Her breath came quick and shallow. She pressed her hands against her chest as if to quiet her racing heart, but the walls of the room felt like they were closing in. It was too much. The silence, The memories, the weight of fear pressing down until it broke something inside her. A sob escaped her throat, raw and uncontrollable. The door creaked softly. Ethan's boots thudded once against the wood floor, then stopped. He didn't come rushing in, didn't demand to know what was wrong. He just stood in the doorway, his tall frame outlined against the glow of the lantern in the hall. Clara froze, her tears spilling faster. In her past, a man entering during her weakness meant danger. But Ethan didn't move closer. He spoke quietly, his voice low and steady. "You're safe here, Clara. That's all you need to know." She turned her face away, ashamed of her tears, but she could feel him there, just standing, giving her the choice. After a long moment, she whispered, broken and trembling, "Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you asking for something?" Ethan took a slow breath, then crossed the room, stopping beside the bed. He didn't sit on it. He lowered himself onto the floor, leaning back against the wall, leaving the space between them untouched. His hands rested on his knees, relaxed, steady. "Because you don't owe me anything," he said simply. "Not your fear, not your trust, not your body. Nothing. You just owe yourself a chance to breathe." Something inside Clara cracked. The sobs came harder now, shaking her entire body. She buried her face in the pillow, terrified of how vulnerable she was, yet unable to stop. And through it all, Ethan stayed. He didn't touch her, didn't shush her, didn't try to fix the pieces of her pain. He just sat, his quiet presence a shield against the memories clawing at her. Minutes turned to hours. The storm outside passed, but inside the room, Clara's tears finally began to slow. When she lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red, Ethan was still there. He hadn't left. His gaze was steady, calm, and full of something she didn't recognize, respect. For the first time in years, Clara realized she wasn't alone in her breaking. And in that silence, she felt the faintest thread of something she thought was gone forever. The possibility of trust. Morning sunlight spilled across the wooden floor of the cabin, filling the silence with a quiet warmth. Clara sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together as if she were bracing for something. The memories of the previous night, her tears, Ethan's stillness beside her, still clung to her like mist that refused to fade. She expected awkwardness, maybe anger, or at least a change in his eyes when he saw her again. But when Ethan walked into the room, his expression carried only the same calm steadiness he always wore. He set a cup of coffee down on the small table beside her. "Drink," he said simply, then pulled up a chair but didn't sit too close. Clara hesitated, studying him, as if waiting for the hidden demand that always came with kindness. When none followed, her chest tightened with confusion. Finally, she found her voice, brittle and uncertain. "Why are you doing this? You gave me your bed. You stayed when I cried. And now this. Why? What do you want from me?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes met hers, steady as the land he worked. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. "I don't want anything from you, Clara. Not a thing. You don't owe me your trust, your love, or even your smile. All I want is for you to feel safe under this roof. That's it. Rest here as long as you need. No one's going to touch you. Not while I'm here." The words hit Clara like a wave. For years, every act of so-called kindness had been a trap. Every gesture tied to a price she had no choice but to pay. But Ethan's words came with no strings, no expectations. It felt impossible, unreal. Her throat tightened and tears welled in her eyes, though this time they weren't born of fear, but of something deeper, relief. She whispered, almost to herself, "No one's ever said that to me before." Ethan's jaw flexed, as if holding back anger, not at her, but at the ghost who had left her this broken. "Then it's about time someone did," he said firmly. The silence stretched, but it wasn't heavy anymore. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, holding it like a lifeline. Slowly, cautiously, a thought bloomed in her heart. Maybe this ranch, this quiet place surrounded by endless sky and open fields, could be more than just a hiding place. Maybe it could be a home. Later that day, she stepped outside for the first time since arriving. The air smelled of earth and pine, the horizon stretching wide and endless. Ethan was already working by the corral, hammering a loose board back into place. When he looked up, he didn't smile, didn't rush to greet her. He simply tipped his hat, as if saying, "You're free to be here, if you want." That small gesture felt bigger than any promise. Clara's chest loosened. For the first time in years, the ground beneath her feet didn't feel like quicksand. It felt steady, safe. As she watched Ethan work, silent and respectful, she realized she was no longer counting the days until she would leave. Instead, she was beginning to wonder what it might mean to stay. The morning sun was already high when Clara stepped out onto the ranch yard, the hem of her dress brushing against the dirt as she carried a small bucket of feed. Ethan was by the fence, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, sweat glistening along his brow as he drove a nail into a loose board. He glanced at her but didn't speak, offering instead that quiet nod she'd grown used to, acknowledgement without pressure. It was strange, Clara thought, how comforting even that small gesture had become. When she sprinkled the feed into the trough, the chickens came rushing in, flapping their wings and clucking loudly. One particularly bold hen hopped onto the rim of the bucket, startling her enough to drop it. The metal clanged against the ground, scattering grain everywhere. Clara froze, expecting Ethan to sigh or criticize her clumsiness. But when she looked up, he was standing there, arms crossed, the corner of his mouth twitching like he was fighting back a grin. "What?" she asked sharply, half defensive. "Nothing," Ethan said, but then the hen fluttered back onto the bucket, squawking indignantly. This time he couldn't hold it in. He laughed. It was a low, rich sound carrying across the yard. For a moment, Clara just stared at him, startled by how it softened his rugged face. And then, before she could stop herself, a laugh escaped her too, light, unguarded, almost foreign on her lips. The sound startled her more than anything else. She hadn't heard her own laughter in years, not real laughter. But there it was, bubbling out of her chest like it had been waiting all this time for release. Ethan stopped hammering, watching her with something almost reverent in his eyes. He didn't comment, didn't tease. He just let her have the moment. The day unfolded in little snapshots of closeness. Clara helped him carry wood for the fence, both of them brushing dust from their clothes as the wind picked up. At lunch, she surprised him by cooking biscuits, slightly burned on the edges but warm and buttery inside. Ethan ate every bite, exaggerating his appreciation until she rolled her eyes and, once again, found herself smiling. Later, while watering the horses, Clara slipped on the wet dirt and splashed herself head to toe. She gasped in shock, cheeks burning, but Ethan only chuckled and handed her a rag. "Guess the horses ain't the only ones who needed a bath," he drawled. She swatted the rag at him, and though the motion was playful, it sent a ripple of warmth through her chest. For the first time, her body wasn't locked tight with fear when she stood close to a man. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, Ethan leaned against the corral fence, watching her brush one of the horses. His face was quiet, thoughtful, but his eyes never left her. Clara felt the weight of his gaze and turned slightly, meeting it just for a second. Instead of flinching, she let it linger. Something stirred in her chest, soft, careful, like the first spark of fire waiting to grow. When evening fell, they sat together on the porch steps with plates of food balanced on their knees. Dust clung to their clothes. The day's work heavy in their muscles, but the silence between them was easy, comfortable. Clara found herself smiling again, small but genuine. Ethan caught it, and though he didn't say a word, his answering smile told her he'd noticed. For Clara, it was a revelation. She hadn't thought she'd ever laugh again. Not like this. But here, in the middle of a dusty ranch with a cowboy who asked for nothing and gave her space to breathe, she found herself coming back to life piece by piece. And for Ethan, watching her laugh felt like watching the sun break through a storm he'd thought would never end. The wind was sharp that evening, carrying dust across the open plains as Clara sat by the porch steps, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The ranch had become a rhythm she clung to, chores, silence, the rare bursts of laughter she now shared with Ethan. For the first time in years, she had begun to feel invisible to her past. Safe, untouchable, but safety, she learned, was fragile. A brittle thing that could shatter in a single heartbeat. The sound of hooves reached her before she saw the riders. Clara stiffened, her breath locking in her chest. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, growing larger with every passing second. Panic clawed at her ribs. She knew that gait, that sharp, commanding posture of the man in front. Her blood turned cold. It was him, her past come riding back with fury. Ethan stepped out from a barn, wiping his hands with a rag. The moment he saw the group of men approaching, his shoulders stiffened, his instinct sharpened, a quiet storm brewing in his chest. He glanced at Clara, whose face had gone pale, her lips trembling as if the words had been stolen straight out of her. That was all the answer he needed. The riders halted just a few yards from the porch. The man in front dismounted with practiced ease, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, carrying himself like he owned the ground he walked on. His voice was like a whip when he spoke. "She's mine. She ran from me, and I'll be taking her back." Clara's stomach twisted. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The words shackled her just as chains once had. But before she could crumble, Ethan stepped forward. His tall frame blocked her from their view. His voice calm but edged with steel. "Not while she's under my roof." A tense silence crackled in the air. The men shifted uneasily, hands resting on the butts of their guns. Ethan didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't need to. His stance, his eyes, his unshaken calm spoke louder than any threat. The ex-husband sneered. "You think you can keep her from me? You don't know what she's done. She's mine by law, by right." Ethan didn't flinch. His words cut like a blade. "You don't own her. Not here. Not ever again." Clara's heart pounded so loud she could hear nothing else. Every instinct told her to run, to hide, but her feet stayed rooted as she watched Ethan stand unshaken in front of the man who had haunted her dreams for years. She expected him to push her forward, to hand her back, to prove once more that men could never be trusted. But Ethan didn't move. He was a wall, a shield. The ex-husband lunged forward, his hand snapping toward Ethan's chest. In a flash, Ethan grabbed his wrist, twisting hard enough to drop the man to his knees. One of the others stepped forward, drawing his gun, but Ethan's voice thundered across the yard. "You'll put that weapon away if you want to leave this place breathing." For a long, tense moment, the world held its breath. Then, slowly, the gun was lowered. The men muttered amongst themselves, torn between their leader's rage and the sheer force of the cowboy who refused to yield. Finally, with curses and promises of return, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving only silence and dust behind. Clara collapsed onto the porch steps, her whole body shaking. She had just faced a monster of her nightmares, and survived, but not because she fought, because someone else had chosen to fight for her. Her tears came in a flood, not of fear but of something far heavier. Release. Ethan crouched beside her, careful not to touch, only letting his voice ground her. "They won't take you, not while I'm breathing." Clara lifted her gaze to him, her eyes searching his face, the steady calm in his expression, the unwavering certainty in his tone. For the first time, she realized Ethan wasn't just a protector. He wasn't just a man standing between her and danger. He was the anchor she had never known she needed. The living proof that safety could exist, not as a fleeting moment, but as a promise. And in that moment, Clara's heart shifted. Fear still lived inside her, yes, but so did something new. A fragile seed of trust, rooted not in words, but in the way Ethan had stood unmovable when her shadows returned. The dust of yesterday's storm still lingered in Clara's chest. Even though the men had ridden away, her hands trembled when she thought of them. But something else lingered too. Ethan's voice, steady and unbreakable, telling her she was safe. That memory had power. For the first time in years, the word safe did not feel like a lie. She woke the next morning with sunlight spilling across the wooden floorboards of the cabin. Ethan had already been up, tending to the animals, chopping wood, moving through his chores with the same silent rhythm he always carried. But when she stepped outside, she saw something different. His eyes softened when they met hers, not with pity, but with quiet pride. For days she had tried to convince herself that his kindness was temporary, that it had strings attached, that sooner or later he would show the same hunger for control as every man before. But after standing unmovable between her and her past, Ethan had proven something else. He wasn't trying to own her. He was trying to give her back to herself. That evening, after supper, Ethan returned from the barn, carrying a small bundle. Clara sat at the table, her shoulders tense, expecting maybe tools or supplies. But when he set the bundle down and unfolded it, she froze. Inside lay a pair of boots, sturdy, well-made leather with stitching so fine it almost looked delicate. They weren't new from a store. Ethan's own hands had shaped them. Her breath caught. "For me?" she whispered. Ethan nodded, his voice calm and low. "You'll never have to walk in fear again. Not in these. Not while I'm here." The words broke something inside her, not in the way pain did, but in the way locked doors finally gave way to light. She touched the boots with trembling fingers, the leather soft and strong beneath her hands. It was not just a gift. It was a promise, a vow stitched into every seam. Clara's throat burned with unshed tears. She wanted to protest, to say she didn't deserve such care. But Ethan only leaned against the table, watching her with a patience that felt infinite. There was no rush, no demand in his eyes, only quiet hope. Slowly, she slipped her feet into the boots. They fit perfectly, hugging her ankles, grounding her to the floor in a way she hadn't felt in years. Standing in them, she felt taller, steadier, as though the ground beneath her had finally chosen to hold her up. Her eyes lifted to Ethan's, and for the first time she didn't look away. The weight of her fear had always made her bow her head, hide her gaze. But now, she stood in front of him, steady, and let herself be seen. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words carried more than gratitude. They carried trust. Ethan gave a small smile, that rare curve of lips that seemed to light the whole room. "No thanks needed. Just keep standing. That's enough." The air between them grew warm, almost tender. Clara's chest swelled with something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. The intimacy wasn't in a touch, but in the quiet, in the way Ethan allowed her to breathe without pressure, to exist without fear. And with the boots by her bedside, Clara closed her eyes, whispering to herself the words Ethan had given her. "I'll never have to walk in fear again." Clara had spent weeks convincing herself that she was only passing through, that sooner or later she would have to pack her few belongings and keep running. That had been her survival for so long. Running before the shadows could catch her. But now, when she stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out at the fences, the horses grazing, the steady rhythm of life, she realized something had changed. For the first time in her life, she wasn't searching for a way out. She was searching for a reason to stay. The ranch no longer looked lonely. It no longer looked like a place meant to carry only Ethan's scars and silence. It looked alive. Animals fed, barns mended, kitchen warm with the scent of bread she had baked. Every little chore she had done, every corner she had touched, had stitched her into the fabric of this land. And in those stitches, she found belonging. That evening, Clara walked out to the barn where Ethan was working. His sleeves were rolled. Sweat glistened on his brow as he lifted bales of hay. The sight of him, strong, steady, dependable, struck her heart with a gentle certainty. She no longer feared what his presence meant. She welcomed it. "I've made my choice," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor in her chest. Ethan paused, his hand stilling. His eyes searched hers, quiet and patient as always. "And what choice is that, Clara?" "To stay," she whispered, and this time there was no hesitation. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I belong." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of what had just been spoken. Then Ethan's expression softened, the rare smile curving across his lips. He set the hay aside, wiped his hands on his shirt, and gave a slow nod. "Then stay, not as a guest, as whatever you choose to be." Her throat tightened. He hadn't demanded, hadn't named her role, hadn't trapped her with expectations. He left it in her hands. That freedom, that trust, was the very thing that made her heart finally let go of its chains. Days passed, and Clara felt the shift inside her with every sunrise. She laughed more easily now, worked with a lightness in her step, and looked forward to evenings by the fire. Ethan never once overstepped, but his presence was always near, like a steady anchor she could lean against. And with every glance they shared, something quiet and undeniable grew. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Clara found herself stepping onto the porch. Ethan was already there, seated on the wooden swing he had built, watching the horizon paint itself gold and crimson. She hesitated, then sat beside him. For the first time, she didn't leave space between them. The silence was peaceful, filled only with the distant call of birds and the soft creak of the swing. Clara drew in a breath, feeling the cool morning air fill her lungs. She turned to Ethan, her lips curving in a small, certain smile. "I never thought love could be real for me," she admitted softly. "But I was wrong. You've shown me it isn't change, it isn't fear, it's this." She gestured at the rising sun, the land before them, and at him. Ethan's gaze held hers, steady and sure. He didn't answer with grand words, but his hand, warm, calloused, strong, rested gently over hers. And in that touch, Clara felt all the promises he had ever kept, and all the ones yet to come. The light broke fully across the land, spilling warmth over the ranch, over them. Clara leaned into the moment, into the man who had given her safety without demand and love without force. She had come here running, broken and afraid, but now she sat with her head high, her heart open. She had come barefoot and broken, but now she stood strong, safe, and finally in love.